I want to bring in another voice now. That's John Feiner, who, of course, is a distinguished fellow in residence at the Yale Law School, served President Biden as Deputy National Security Advisor, and was Chief of Staff in the State Department Director of Policy Planning under President Obama. John, let me just ask you, first of all, sort of what you're expecting. You're no stranger to summits like this one, and I'm very curious sort of what you think the agenda is likely to look like here, how large you think Iran is going to loom.
Well, for one thing, whatever is actually on the formal agenda, President Trump has found a way, as he often does, to make the summit all about him. All of the leaders who are present will be focused on whether the Iran war is finally about to end, or whether at least this is the beginning of the end. This war has done enormous damage to many of their economies, probably more damage to their economies in many cases than the U.S. economy, even though the U.S. chose to start this war. And whether or not President Trump reaches an agreement, I think one thing that's important not to forget is this agreement is likely to have been available to President Trump before he even went to war in the first place. The other leaders know that. They want this war to end. They want there to be an agreement, but they aren't, whatever they say publicly, going to feel thankful to President Trump for achieving this milestone. The war didn't achieve this. The Iranians were making this offer available to the U.S. Absent the war.
John, I also want to ask you about, I know it's early and we're basing it on some unconfirmed reporting, but the outline of this MOU is looking very similar to what was in the JCPOA. And some of our colleagues here at Bloomberg, I think if we can pull it up, have done basically a chart that shows where it's similar and where the JCPOA actually had stronger guardrails than what is being proposed right now. My question is this something that you think, first of all, is durable? And second of all, you've got the president saying in his very large, exuberant tweet that this strait will be open immediately after this is signed. Is that realistic? Is that there's a lot of other factors other than the strait being open because Iran says it is. We've got mines, as we were talking about earlier, and just the confidence of these shipping operators being willing to send their vessels and their personnel back into a region when this is a very tenuous deal that is not necessarily guaranteed to last more than a couple weeks.
So I think the first important thing to bear in mind is this is an area of diplomacy where details really matter. We have a president, President Trump, who likes to make big pronouncements, announce frameworks of understanding. Sometimes they're like a page long without a lot of the details fleshed out or even necessarily agreed by the two sides when you ask them what they actually think is in the deal. That won't work in this case. The Iran nuclear deal that President Obama reached was 120 plus pages long. It had a lot of technical details about nuclear physics, limits that were placed on Iran's nuclear program. And importantly, and we haven't heard anything about this in the context of the current deal, the allowance for international monitors to be physically present in all of Iran's nuclear facilities 24/7 to make sure that they weren't doing anything that they were not supposed to be doing. And we know, based on those monitors, based on our own intelligence, based even on Israeli intelligence, that Iran was complying with the deal. We don't know if we're going to have that sort of access this time. So the durability of the deal will depend to some extent on how enforceable it is and how we can monitor it. And I think that's going to be quite important. What you'll probably see announced is, a page and a half, where the president says we have an understanding on big topics and we'll work on all the details over the next 30 days or 60 days. By the way, after those 30 days and 60 days, all of this could unravel. The Iranians are very difficult negotiators. It took us 2 years to reach all of the different understandings present in the JCPOA, all of the fine print, not 30 days or 60 days, and they haven't even really started talking about that yet.
John Feiner, talk to me about sequencing in a deal like this one. We're using that word a lot to describe what would be in this memo of understanding. This would have to happen by X date for Y to happen. Y would have to happen by this date for Z to happen. And I think that a critic would say, by having that unfold in that way, there were ample opportunities here for the Iranians to bow out of this deal, to push back on the deal, to reopen it, I suppose, for renegotiation if you want to be charitable about it. How do you think about sequencing when you're crafting a deal like this one, be it a page long, like this memo of understanding, or one that's 100 plus pages like the one that you worked on?
So what the president is trying to emphasize, and that what we emphasized in the Iran nuclear deal as well, is that Iran should not get money for nothing, to use the phrase. Iran should only get paid when it takes steps that it has agreed to take to reduce its nuclear program, reopen the strait, all of the various things that the United States is seeking. So we'll have to see how that all works. But one thing that I think is important to keep in mind, Iran believes it has the upper hand in these negotiations, believes it could allow the war to continue long longer, and that the pain would increase on the United States and on the rest of the world and be more intolerable than the pain that the United States is imposing on Iran. So they are not going to end this war without getting significantly compensated for doing so, whether that be through frozen funds that are currently frozen because of U.S. sanctions being unfrozen and provided to Iran, whether that be through the licensing of commercial activity that is currently sanctioned for other countries to do business with Iran. They're going to find a way to use this deal to rebuild their economy and replace some of the damage that's been done during the course of this war. So one way or another, you can guarantee that that will be a facet of this agreement. The U.S. will try to withhold those benefits until Iran takes the steps that it's agreed to.
There's another element of this, and we've heard from the president over and over again that the U.S. is going to go in and get this, what he keeps calling nuclear dust. And we were in the newsroom this morning, and I was confused by that because we've talked to folks who deal with this, and they said that's not the form. It's a gas. It's in these like giant scuba tank containers. We were looking it up, and you know this is something that the president has said and others have said, but he uses a lot. I guess the thought is that he's the U.S. has struck these plants so much that that's basically all that's left. Can you talk to us about what is actually left, what form that nuclear material is in? And we also have these reports from CNN that the Iranians are basically kind of trying to bury these even further, so they're getting harder to access. Is the thought there that they can say to the U.S., they're not a threat anymore, we've buried them, or that they're so hard to get the U.S. kind of gives up?
So the president is a lot of things. He is not a nuclear physicist or someone with a deep understanding, I believe, of how nuclear material works. By the way, on the Obama team that did the Iran nuclear deal was the Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, who was an MIT professor of nuclear physics. So we did have that technical expertise in our team, and it actually helped. It mattered a lot in terms of working out the details. That's not present this time. Not clear that the team that's negotiating this is working with true nuclear experts. What the president is referring to is uranium that has been enriched to 60% purity. 90% is weapons grade. To go from 60% enriched uranium to 90% is a very small technical step that would not take a lot of time, which is why the world and the United States is so worried about this roughly 1,000 pounds of nuclear material that Iran still has somewhere that's enriched to 60%. We believe that it's buried in tunnels underneath a bombed facility in a place called Esfahan. That is where the United States believes this nuclear material is. And what Trump is demanding is that Iran ship this material out to the United States, to somewhere else, so that it is no longer physically present in Iran. It does not seem like Iran has agreed to that. So an alternative to shipping that material out could be that the material is diluted. The technical term is downblended to a lower level of enrichment. That is better than the current state, but it does leave the material in a condition that Iran could re-enrich it, could purify it again back up to weapons grade. It would just take a longer period of time. So that's what's being negotiated in the run-up to this deal. It does look like that material will stay in Iran, this nuclear dust that the president refers to try to make it seem innocuous, which it very much is not.
John, one more question to you before we have to go to our colleague Josh Wingrove, who's in Geneva, and it has to do with how you're watching all of this unfold. I think Christina and I are reacquainting ourselves with all of the semi-official news agencies in Iran that are reporting on the details of what may or may not be in this deal, how these negotiations are going. Bloomberg had a piece this week just about the complexity of doing this kind of negotiation through a proxy like Pakistan, that literally it has to be couriered through Iran, and because the supreme leader is in hiding, that makes it even more difficult. It takes a much longer time. You're now out of government, an academician. How are you following this? Who are you listening to? Give us some counsel on what we should be watching for, because it does seem like weekend after weekend, there is a routine to the way that the media broadly report on this. The president says one thing, it's usually rosy and optimistic, and then there's either pushback from the Iranians or nothing from the Iranians. Who are you listening to? Who should we be listening to for indications that this is, in fact, progressing?
Look, it's a very important point, and it's one big difference between today and 10 years ago when the Iran nuclear deal was reached. Now you get 3, 4, sometimes more versions of events as they're unfolding. The official White House view, whatever the Iranians put out through their news agencies, the Israelis often give their own interpretation or version of events. And then you have the mediators in these talks, Pakistanis, the Gulf countries, trying to put out on background what they believe is actually in this negotiation. And I think a fundamental problem is you used to be able to rely on the U.S. government, if not to do the right thing, because people will debate whether or not the Iran nuclear deal was right or wrong. but it was very clear what was in it. And we published the entire thing. It was in all its detail made available to the public so they could assess and experts could assess. In the current moment, we have not seen a physical document that tells us what is in this deal. And until that happens, just given the tendency of all of the sides that I just described to traffic in disinformation, including, and it kind of pains me to say this, the U.S. government, we should wait until we see what is actually in the deal if they publish it. The problem is, as I said at the beginning, this might be a relatively short document that doesn't have a lot of detail and punts all the hard issues to the talks. And in that case, we really will not know how this ultimately ends or whether this will be over for another 30 or 60 days.